Hey guys, this is for APUS. If you haven't seen the video I left you yesterday, please go back and watch that first before you go back to come back and watch this video. Please try to watch them in sequence. If you did watch yesterday's video, then keep listening. Okay, so today we're going to talk about President Truman's record domestically. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about Truman's foreign policy, where he was pretty successful in trying to contain communism with containment and the Truman Doctrine and the formation of NATO and all of that, ultimately waging the Korean War, which, had mixed results. But in terms of his domestic record, President Truman actually had a lot more difficulty there. Truman was a New Deal liberal in really every sense of the word. He was a hardcore anti-communist in terms of domestic policy, in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of domestic policy, Truman was a was a was a Roosevelt guy all the way, and he was faced with some really difficult conditions post-war economically in the first few years of his administration. Now, Truman believed in the social welfare legislation of the New Deal, and he actually wanted to expand it, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Truman's biggest problem domestically when he first entered office, right after World War II ended, within a few months of him taking office after he dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. But the biggest problem was rampant inflation. Prices were going through the roof. There was so much consumer demand because remember, things had been rationed so much during the Second World War that, now that the war was over, people wanted to buy a lot of stuff. And the government kind of had this hodgepodge economic policy. Basically, during the war, we had price controls to make sure that inflation was controlled and that prices didn't rise too high. After the war was over, price controls were lifted on some items, but they weren't lifted on other items. So a lot of the producers of the commodities that still had price controls on them were very, very angry. The fact that they couldn't raise their prices beyond the wartime levels. But people who they could raise their prices. The people who made products where the price controls had already been lifted, prices were going through the roof. So there was really a conflict. Truman, being more of a supporter of government regulation of the economy, wanted to continue wartime price controls. Business did not want that because, as you can imagine, business does not want government price controls. So finally, they wound up passing new price controls, but in weakened form. The price controls were adamantly opposed by farmers because they wanted the free market to basically dictate the prices that they could sell their products to. So farmers refused to sell grain in 1945, late 1945 into 1946, and this was a really serious problem because the American public needs grain, but also the people of Europe who are facing starvation needed American grain. Now, so that was a really big problem. The high prices on on some consumer goods, the goods where either the price controls had been lifted or were still intact but weaker, prices kept going up. So a lot of workers couldn't afford to buy things anymore because of the high prices. So 1946 was really probably best remembered by those who lived it as a year of strikes. There were 4.5 million striking workers in the United States in that year. Steel went on strike. The coal miners went on strike, and railroads went on strike. These are three vital industries to the American economy, and then plus the farmers not selling grain. The miners went on a 40-day strike, and the strike only ended the process of ending the strike only commenced when Truman had the government actually seized the mines. In response to the strike. Finally, the mine owners agreed to the strikers' demands at Truman's insistence, saying that you have to get You have to get these people back to work. Railroad workers threatened to go out on strike. Did go out on strike. Which threatened to paralyze the entire economy if the railroad strike continued. Finally, that ended when President Truman threatened to actually draft all the striking workers into the army, unless they went back to work. So labor unrest was kind of like a recurring theme of 1946. So things domestically just seemed like a mess as we were getting into the congressional elections in 1946. Remember, every 2 years there's congressional elections. So things just seemed like a complete mess domestically, and the Republicans actually sensed an opportunity. The Democrats had control over Congress for 16 years, and the Republicans wanting to take control over Congress and and running against the Democrats under these pretty chaotic conditions that Truman was governing under, actually had a two-word slogan: had enough. Basically trying to convince the voter, well, it's obvious, trying to convince the voters to pull the Republic to vote Republican. Now, also, when a party's in power, a person's in power for too long, often that just leads to fatigue with that party. It's very hard for a party to sustain its power, for anything approaching this level of time, 16 years. To err is Truman was another slogan they used. Remember Shakespeare, I think at Twelfth Night, the line is to forgive is human. And they changed it, the Republicans, is to err is Truman, meaning to err, meaning to make a mistake. And at the end of the day, in the election, the Republicans wound up gaining control of both houses of Congress, of both the House and the Senate. So this was going to present Harry Truman with some incredible difficulty, but also political opportunity, right? If he could kind of position himself as a foil to the Republicans in Congress. Now, the 80th Congress of 1947-1948 was the first Republican Congress in 16 years. And the leader of the Republicans in the Senate was a man named Robert Taft. Robert Taft, the son of the former president, was a hardcore right winger. My grandfather loved Robert Taft, and Robert Taft was kind of a really limited government guy, and he actually said, "quote," that his guiding principle in terms of running the Senate during these years, we have to break with the corrupting idea that the government can legislate prosperity, equality, or opportunity. So that is a very conservative statement that Taft is making right there. And the Republicans interpreted their victory in the congressional elections in 1946 as a mandate for conservative policies. They totally overreached. People were just tired of the bad economic conditions in 1946. I don't think they really signed on to some larger right-wing agenda. But the Republicans interpreted their victory as such. They refused to raise the minimum wage. They refused to provide education money, federal money for education, federal money for housing. Seems familiar. Basically, really advancing a pretty conservative agenda. The most famous example of a law that the most famous example of a law passed by the Republican Congress in 1947 was a bill called the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed basically in response to a lot of the labor unrest in 1946, the year earlier. And the Taft-Hartley Act was basically a government attempt to control the power of organized labor. For one, the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed the close shop. Now, the close shop is when you have to join the union in order to get the job. Conservatives don't like that because they say it takes away your freedom of choice. So it outlawed that. So you can never be mandated to join a union in order to get a job, even though you still might have to pay the union dues, even if you don't want to join the union, because the idea is, well, you're still benefiting from the union in terms of what the union negotiates for you, even if you don't want to join the union itself. Some states pass laws, and they've still been passing them up to the past few years, called right to work laws, basically saying that even if you don't want to join the union, you also don't have to pay the dues. I think about 20 states today are right to work states, but New York is not one. So in New York, even if you don't want to join the union, which is your right, according to the Taft-Hartley Act, you still have to pay the dues. So the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed the clothes shop. It outlawed secondary boycotts and strikes. Basically, like if one union goes out on strike, you can't have other unions also go out on strike. That really are not connected to the original union strike, because that's what unions used to do. Like if one big union went on strike, other smaller unions went on strike in sympathy in order to enhance the power of the original strikers. So that was outlawed under Taft-Hartley. It also gave the president permission to stop any strike for 80 days. So if a strike was going to happen, the president could declare an 80-day cooling off period where both sides could negotiate with one another and presumably, come to some sort of resolution. President Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act. He called it a slave labor bill instead of a labor bill, but his veto was overridden. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act really harmed organized labor big time, but it actually helped Harry Truman politically. A lot of unions and a lot of workers were not thrilled with Harry Truman by his conduct in 1946, right? By threatening to draft the miners, by and the railroad workers. So the thing, and Truman seizing the mines. So a lot of union leaders were not thrilled about Truman's conduct in 1946. But after he vetoed Taft-Hartley and kind of embraced New Deal principles, re-embraced New Deal principles, unions and workers generally went back to Harry Truman and the Democratic Party. So Taft-Hartley Act actually helped Harry Truman's position politically. Now, Truman adopted a more liberal stance to kind of be a foil to the Republicans who control Congress. He began advocating federal aid to education, slum clearance, which is where the government would actually pay to knock down slums and build better housing in their place. That actually wound up having unintended consequences because when slum clearance was ultimately passed a few years later, sometimes viable neighborhoods, even though they were poor, were destroyed and replaced by housing projects, which actually contribute to the ghettoization of a lot of America's cities. But at the time, slum clearance was actually seen as a progressive initiative. Truman advocated greater farm subsidies, and also Truman advocated universal health insurance, saying that every American should be covered by the government with health insurance, and which is something we're still fighting this issue to this day. Now, spend the next few minutes talking about Harry Truman and civil rights. Now, Harry Truman was really the first president, arguably since Ulysses Grant, who actually made civil rights for blacks a major issue. The Roosevelt administration, even though it enjoyed the support of a lot of black Americans, and black Americans admired Franklin Roosevelt, wrote the New Deal, as we talked about, did do some things to advance the condition of black Americans. It generally took a pretty passive stance in the fight for civil rights. Truman actually took a very active stance in pushing for civil rights. In 1947, he appointed a Civil Rights Commission, which actually came up with a whole bunch of proposals to end racial discrimination, both politics and employment. And Harry Truman, as president, actually embraced the whole 10-point platform. Now, Truman really believed that this was a moral issue, that the United States had to face the fact that it was systematically discriminating against black Americans. Foreign policy also played a role because remember, this is the Cold War, and we're talking about human rights around the world in Europe and in Asia, and look how we're treating our fellow Americans. So there was a foreign policy component to Harry Truman's embrace of civil rights. It's all the more remarkable, I think, that Harry Truman embraced civil rights the way that he did, since he was from Missouri. But remember, well, I don't know if you remember from 10th grade, but Missouri was a border state. It was a slave state. So there was a lot of pro-Confederate feeling in Missouri, and he grew up in a house that was pro-Confederate. His mother's family celebrated when Lincoln was killed. And his mom, who was actually still alive when he became president, when she visited the White House, she refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. So this is kind of the background that he comes from. So I think it's even more remarkable that he actually made civil rights a really major agenda item of his. And the thing is that this was very risky politically because remember the South was still the base of the Democratic Party and the South was intent on keeping their racist laws. So Truman actually jeopardized his own standing in the Democratic Party by by embracing civil rights, by actually losing the support of a lot of Southerners. So it was a very brave um, a moral step by Truman, but it was also a very brave move by Harry Truman as well. Probably the most famous act that Harry Truman initiated to advance the rights of Black Americans was in 1948. He issued Executive Order 9981, which ordered the desegregation of the U.S. military. Um, Basically, white people and black people who are in the military would now fight together. Segregation actually been the name of the game during the entirety of World War II, where there were black regiments and white regiments. And Truman ordered the integration of the military. Conservatives didn't like this. Even General Eisenhower, who's probably the most respected figure in the U.S. military, didn't like it either because he thought it would, be risky to unit cohesion to actually desegregate the military. But Truman's act, which actually took a few years to implement, led to truly remarkable social change in the United States. It led to more acceptance of the idea of integration in general. A lot of white people, the white men, the first time they met a black man or got to know a black man was in the military. And remember, this was a time of a universal draft, so almost every guy did a year in the military. So this actually led to a lot more acceptance of integration. Interestingly, the year before is when Jackie Robinson actually integrated Major League Baseball. So sports and the military, which were often seen as very conservative institutions, actually, were the ones that were at the forefront of integration. Actually, began the chipping away at, discrimination in the United States, even though we had a long, long, long way to go. But Harry Truman does deserve a lot of credit for actually getting the ball rolling by actually embracing civil rights. Also, 1947, 1948 was a really important year in the Middle East. The UN actually authorized the division of Palestine, which was owned by the British, into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, Harry Truman was sympathetic to the cause of Zionism, but he did have, and I remember I read a book about this a few years ago. Truman did have some reservations about Zionism in general, saying is it racially discriminatory to have a country just for one ethnicity, one group of people? So he did have some reservations. Plus, there were a lot of people in the State Department who had even more serious reservations because they said if the United States supported a Jewish state in Israel, that would to completely turn off the Arab states and potentially jeopardize our supply of oil. So a lot of the professionals in the State Department actually urged Truman not to recognize a Jewish state in the Middle East. Um, Truman actually said later on that his views were deeply affected by a really good friend of his, a man named Eddie Jacobson, who actually was a friend of his from the Army, also had been his partner in the men's clothing shop back in the day. They stayed close friends even after that business failed. And Mr. Jacobson actually went to the White House and actually talked to Truman about the need for a Jewish state. And Truman ultimately said, Hitler had killed so many Jews, millions of Jews, and Jews suffered so much during World War II that they deserve a state of their own. So 11 minutes after the state of Israel was declared in May 1948, Truman extended U.S. recognition to the new Jewish state. So, and that was a really big deal, right, for Israel to actually get the support of the United States. Interestingly, the Soviets also recognized the state of Israel, hoping that Israel in the very beginning, actually, back when it was Palestine, actually had a kind of a socialist type economy with the kibbutzes and everything. And the Soviets were hoping vainly that that the Israelis might be an ally of theirs. But of course, that did not happen. Israel became the strongest U.S. ally in the Middle East, and the Arab countries turned to the Soviet Union for assistance, which actually fostered deep Russian Arab partnerships that in many ways last to the current day. Like, even in the recent Syrian civil war, it was the Russians that actually propped up the Syrian regime, and a lot of that goes back to the 1940s and 1950s, when the Soviets deliberately cultivated a relationship with the Arab nations, who were angry at the United States for having supported the establishment of the State of Israel. All right, guys, very good. So hopefully you watched this video from start to finish. I'm going to post on Google Classroom homework assignment for you guys to complete. When I see you guys on Thursday, we're going to talk about the 1948 election. Truman looked like he was in very, very bad shape running for a term of his own right, but the election turned out to be, I don't want to give anything away, but the election turned out to be, you know, a really, really big upset. That's a giant hint, I guess. All right, so I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.